Our next talk is by Michael Dobrich about modern camera handling in Chromium.
You need to move a bit up.
Oh, he's going to move the camera.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll talk a bit about camera handling in Chromium. I think Wim already teased some of the things at the end of his talk. So you'll notice similarities or recurring things that you already mentioned. But I'm going to dive deeper into how this actually works and the implementation, how we got to where we are now, and what's still missing. OK, so let's start a short bit about me. I'm Michael Dobrich, and I work for Pengutronics. I'm an embedded developer, Linux embedded developer, mostly doing graphics kind of things and these stuff, exactly. OK, so what's right now in Chromium is basically video for Linux. And anyone who doesn't know what video for Linux is here in the room? A few people. OK, just a few words. Video for Linux is the kernel API to talk to cameras, or other devices too, but in this, interesting here is camera. It's relatively simple API, just watch the formats and give me a frame, right? And if you look at the Chromium code, I'd say, well, there's little development, but it's basically done. We'll get to that information a bit later because that's why I'm mentioning it. I mean, the camera, the API is stable. It hasn't changed a lot, and the camera is working in the browser, so there's not much to do to change that. And then I started with a project where we wanted to do a bit more with cameras on a Linux system. It was a more or less embedded device, and the first thing was we want to choose if an application can use a camera and which camera it's supposed to use or allowed to use. And that's currently not possible because Chromium directly talks with the kernel and just picks a camera, right? And then there were web pages that didn't have the API to the new API to do screen sharing. That didn't use that, so we wanted to basically pipe in the screen as a camera into this web page. That was mostly in the earlier days of the video conferencing kind of things, and more the commercial applications that they had their products ready and done and didn't want to implement new kind of things. It's getting less, but it's still, some of them are still out there. And then there were some cameras that were only H.264. That's not supported by, I don't think any browser on Linux actually can handle H.264 only cameras for cameras in the browser. And then I wanted to attach IP cameras. So I have the camera maybe back there in the room, and I want to use that for a camera in a video conference call. Right? If you have a bigger room and you don't want to use a long USB cable, then network would be ideal, but I can't attach an IP camera to video for Linux, right? So that's what we're stating, but these are not exactly common use cases. I was looking for something I could argue, what can I do to bring this to Chromium mainline? So if I want to implement something there, I need something what's more, yeah, good, an excuse exactly to say this is useful for other people too. So I started looking, and the first thing that I came across then was, because I was also looking at, or had used the screen sharing part, which works with the portal kind of things and in containers. That was my first use case. Where I said, hey, these kind of people, and that's what Wim mentioned earlier as well, is we want to say who's allowed to use the camera. And that was one use case I had in mind to say, hey, we need a new high-level API. We need an API where we can say outside of the browser if the browser is allowed to use the camera. And then while I was already implementing this kind of things, actually the libcamera stuff came up. Wim also mentioned that in his talk, that we have new ways to talk to cameras, and there was no backend in Chromium there. And so the idea was to promote and say, hey, let's use this shared high-level API for the browsers and just plug in the libcamera at the backend, which, by the way, is already implemented. Because, yeah, I'll get to that in a second. So we want to do the authorization kind of thing, and we want to do high-level API so we can put something else in behind. And the solution was already there. As soon as I really started looking, it was obvious because the XDG desktop portal kind of thing, that's the portal stuff that Wim mentioned, it already had an API for camera. It was basically not used, I think. I didn't find any real-life implementations that used it in the common case, but it was already there. And so I said, OK, let's do that. And I already was involved with Pipewire and used it for the screen sharing kind of thing. So nothing new to me. And I said, OK, let's implement that. And I started to implement. But before that, I want to say a bit about how it works. Right? So the browser needs to talk to the portal and say, hey, I access camera. That's basically the API call to the portal and say, hey, I want to access the camera. Am I allowed to do that? And say, OK, yeah, you're allowed to do that. OK, great. Then, well, yeah, I need this Pipewire remote, this basically the connection to the Pipewire, and say, OK, well, and then the portal says, OK, Pipewire connect. We want to talk to you. And what the portal is doing then is restricting access. So the browser won't have access to everything that's available on Pipewire, but actually only the cameras, because we only allowed access to the cameras. There's a lot more details there in the background, but for the Chromium side, for the implementation, we don't need to care about that. So, and then the portal hands over the file descriptor to Chromium, and Chromium can talk to Pipewire directly and access cameras there. And then the Chromium starts sending messages basically to Pipewire and says, hey, we'll need the objects, and then the objects show up, and I need your properties for all the objects, and basically builds up a list of cameras. But it takes several round trips between Chromium and Pipewire to get to that list. That will be important again later as well, because we're talking multiple processes here, and so it can take a bit of time. And once we're there, the user selects a camera and says, OK, we want to start streaming. Then we'll start streaming, and Pipewire sends video frames over to Chromium. That's basically the easy part at the end, although there is some format handling there involved as well. So, OK, first try. I was a bit naive, actually, at that point. I started implementing this kind of thing. That was basically 2 years ago. And I had more or less it's not pull request in Garrett, it's change set, I think. It's change list, CL, whatever. And, well, I posted it. I had it ready for review, and there was not a lot of review going on. But I'm not trying to blame anyone here, but as I said at the beginning, the camera stuff in Chromium was basically done. So there were not a lot of people working on that. Also, they knew maybe the Chromium camera API and Video for Linux, but I had this new Pipewire portal dbus code in there, and none of the developers were actually familiar with that kind of code. So it was slow going. There was mostly some high-level review for how the integration worked. And then there were some issues with, OK, this is not just Chromium. This is also Google Chrome. And that's a binary build that's deployed on multiple platforms. So we cannot just link to Pipewire, because it may not be there. So we need to load it dynamically. But WebRTC, and when I talk about WebRTC in this talk, I'm talking about the implementation used by the browsers, not the specification kind of things. So in WebRTC, Pipewire is also loaded dynamically for the screen sharing. That should have been a red flag for me, but I didn't notice at the time. So basically, WebRTC tried to load Pipewire. I tried to load Pipewire in Chromium, and that clashed. There were just architectural problems to do both at the same time. And that's when we're stuck a bit and thinking about how to work around that issue. And the merge request basically stalled a bit. And then someone came on the platform, say Jan Grulich, for example, and he was actually someone who knew about the Pipewire stuff, about the portal stuff, and said, hey, well, we shouldn't do that in Chromium, we should do that in WebRTC. I say, okay, great. I was actually sitting down with them and with Jan and Mark Foltz in a video conference, and we talked a bit about the architecture side and say, okay, right, WebRTC is the right place, because if I put it in WebRTC is also used by Firefox. So Firefox can also use my implementation to do cameras. So second try, do it in WebRTC. There is already a camera API that's used by Firefox, actually. And on Linux, it just implements Video for Linux. So the idea was I put a backend for Pipewire in WebRTC. And I put a backend for WebRTC in Chromium. Basically, just an indirection. Yeah, there was an API, but there were some issues. I mean, it was an API designed for APIs like Video for Linux. And if you enumerate devices in Video for Linux, you can do that basically instantaneously. Just open a few file descriptors, send a few ioctls, and you're done. So there was a synchronous call to give me all the cameras. And well, as I showed before, we need to talk to the portal. The portal may actually ask the user if the application is allowed to access the camera. And then we need to iterate over the devices found, or the cameras found in Pipewires. That's not something we can do in a synchronous function call in a browser. So I needed a new asynchronous API to do actually this enumeration. And then for the API was also, here's the static function, give it a string as an argument to select the camera, and open this camera for me. Same issue here. I need, or similar issue related, I have this open connection to Pipewire that I need to keep open to access the camera. Otherwise, you would need to talk to the portal again, which doesn't make sense. So basically need some state carried over from the enumeration of the cameras to actually accessing the cameras. Wasn't there either, so needed new API. And on the other end of the API, the frames that came out of the stack were already converted to IA420, some pixel format, and this included a copy. Basically, WebRTC took the raw frame from the camera, converted or copied it to the new format, and then handed it out to the browser. But Chromium basically assumed that the camera would give it the raw frame from the camera, converted it itself, or copied it. So if I would use that API, I would just basically have two copies. Wanted to avoid that, so I need a new API to access the raw frame from the browser. So suddenly, my single merge request to just add the camera support to Chromium grew a bit. So it was a little bit more than that. So, right. And at the end of the day, I wanted to do this without causing any regressions, right? So the first step is we add a flag, a feature flag, actually, in Chromium. So if you want to use that, once it's merged, it will be disabled by default at first. So if you want to try it, you need to enable this feature flag and says, we want to use Pipewire for cameras. Okay, if we put that, then we go to libWebRTC and so ask libWebRTC, hey, and there is a software switch basically, and I built what's used by the implementation in Chromium and says, okay, we want to use Pipewire. So that's why we're going here. There's also a Video for Linux implementation. That's not used by Chromium because Chromium has its own Video for Linux implementation. So this way, if we say Pipewire is not enabled, this is actually implemented for Firefox because we may want to disable the Pipewire stuff in libWebRTC from the Firefox side of things if it's disabled there, and then just go this route to the Video for Linux implementation in WebRTC, but that's not used in Chromium. So we say, okay, Pipewire is enabled, so we go here. That portal. Is the portal actually available? So we have a build from Chromium and at some point enable it maybe always but still the Linux system underneath may not have a portal implementation running, right? So if that fails, we need to go back, okay, Video for Linux is disabled, and then we fall back to the Video for Linux implementation in Chromium. But if it works, then we ask the user. That may be cached or is often cached. So this you won't see that more than once typically. But if the user says, yes, this Chromium is allowed to use the camera, then we actually get access to the camera. And here's where the pipewire stuff actually starts. So you need to set the switch and then hopefully have a working portal set up, and then you can use the camera this way. Okay, where are we? I mean, part of this talk is to say to raise a bit of awareness. Maybe someone who can review more things or maybe add stuff later on. So let's talk about what's there. First commit was split out generic portal pipewire code. That was code used in the screen sharing for the portal that could also be used for camera sharing with the portal. So we put that in a place where it can be shared. Then the next part was the raw frame. I mentioned that earlier. We don't want to do the double copy. That was basically adding a bit of new API. And then merged, I think just 2 days ago, is the actual pipewire portal capture support within WebRTC. That was merged just a few days ago. So, right. So the WebRTC is mostly done. I'm not sure what Firefox will do. They can, basically it's ready for Firefox people to implement things in Firefox. So if I don't know if someone was working on it. If not, maybe someone here is interested in that, so they can do that part. And there's basically just a small merge request left because all this camera kind of things in WebRTC is not actually built right now if we're building WebRTC for Chromium. So we need just to do in the infrastructure a bit, build these files as well. That's all the WebRTC side, right? Then we come to Chromium. And in Chromium, there are 2 commits pending. None of them have been merged yet. The first is basically, well, there is this Linux camera backend right now in Chromium, which is Video for Linux backend. So basically, rename it from Linux to Video for Linux, place a switch in front of it. That's where this feature flag comes in, where we say, OK, can we do a portal or not? And so we make space to put a separate backend there next to it. And the second commit is the actual implementation. And once that's merged, then we actually have the full support. And hopefully that happens in the next few, well, weeks is probably a bit optimistic, but months. OK. What's next? So for me, I probably won't work on these kind of things in the near future because this was done for a customer project, and it's taken a long time, and they're getting, well, they've been good sport about this, so it's really, there was no complaining, but I do need to get on with other kind of things. I haven't done this full time, right? This was always, I do a bit, then wait for review, then get some review. So these kind of things. But I need to get this finished up, but there are more features to come. There is some new XCG Desktop Portal device API. It was mentioned on one of my merge requests that there's some API stuff coming that's still not merged. There's open pull request, but once that's in, the idea would be to support that to access cameras. And then there is some more features that Chromium supports for cameras, like rotation, that are not yet supported by the new backend. I'm not sure if the whole stack below that already supports all of it. I'm pretty sure that Pipewire does. I'm not quite certain, but I think so. There is API in WebRTC for rotation. So I think it mostly needs to be hooked up. So we can rotate the camera image from 90, 180, or 270 degrees. And then there are also features. Basically, if you know Video for Linux, they have the controls to do panning, tilting, zooming, focus handling, whatever. And kind of a few of those things are integrated in Chromium as basically image properties, I think. And they are hooked up in the Video for Linux backend. But I don't think there is an API in Pipewire to access that. I'm not quite sure. So maybe we need to add it to the whole stack. So there's some work to be done there as well. But my hope is that at some point that gets added, and then we can really switch the Pipewire camera on as default in Chromium, because I don't think it will be accepted as a default unless we have a more or less basic feature parity there. So still work to be done. So hopefully maybe someone got interested and will help out there. OK. A few thanks. Wolf Vision, that's my customer who sponsored this work, so I'll put them here there. Jan Grulich and Mark Foltz, they were the ones, they actually got the review started because they did the, once they got involved, they noticed my patches. They found people that actually could press the necessary buttons on the review and say, OK, this is accepted. And they did a lot of review there, talked to me about the architecture, so they helped me get on with it. And Ilya, and Alex Cooper, they did a lot of review as well. And Kieran Bingham, he's doing a lot of lib camera work. Mentioned my work actually last year on ELCE. But he's done a lot of testing because he is trying out his lib camera stuff in combination with my Chromium patches. So a lot of testing and review there as well. And probably a few more reviewers that I missed. I just went over the list, people that said something on the request and went to the longest, those that seemed to had the most comments there. OK. I'm almost done, so I'll come to your question in a second. So yeah, like everybody, we're hiring. All of our companies need good people. OK, so thanks and questions. So I'll start with you.
Yeah, just a comment that Kieran is going to give a talk on lib camera in 1 hour in the 7 room.
Yeah, okay. Kieran is giving a talk about lib camera in which the embedded automotive room. So maybe I'll be there. Exactly. So any other questions? OK, here.
Is there a place with a common discussion to follow all the bits, or do we need to keep an eye on merge requests and account project to know what's right now?
I don't. If there's a page for all the bits, no, I don't have any web page or anything for that. But if you basically subscribe to the last one, that's the one where it gets interesting, right? OK. Any other questions? OK, then we're done. Thank you.